All right. I am joined once again by Matt McManus and Russell Sbriglia to complete the trilogy, finish watching Slavoj Žižek's 2019 debate with Jordan Peterson. And this is actually kind of funny because we were just talking before we went live about how people I think it would be safe to say like right-wing intellectual Twitter was mad at Matt today because you wrote an article about Edmund Burke a while ago.
Back in February, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so like months ago, you wrote this article about Edmund Burke for Jacobin. Jacobin tweeted it back out today, and this is the time all these people saw it. And I don't know how many of them actually read the article, but like at least they saw the tweet with like the
very small number.
Yeah, the subheading or whatever for the article saying like, Burke and conservatism was all about defending traditional hierarchies, and they all took offense to this. So anyway, unrelated, but let's watch Jordan Peterson.
Oh, I just wanted to say before we begin, because this is really what I came on here to say. Over the last week, I've been reflecting upon our experiences and trying to figure out what actually constitutes a solid film trilogy. And I've only ever been able to come up with two where all three movies are really good, or there's not like one evident black sheep. Three. There's the Star Wars original trilogy. All three of them are pretty good. Everybody seems to not like Return of the Jedi as much, but like still a good movie. Then there's the Dark Knight trilogy. Again, very strong. People have their favorites, but nobody sits there and saying like that movie just sucked. Indiana Jones trilogy. I guess, and the last one would then be Richard Linklater, for those who haven't seen it, the Before trilogy, which is really solid. Also ends with like the longest on-screen fight between a couple you'll ever see, so don't watch it with a loved one. But I'm hoping that we get to fall in auspicious company like those four trilogies.
Fair enough.
It'd be nice. Well, it's rare. It's rare.
It's hard. Yeah.
It's a pink elephant.
Oh, J. Andrew World said Evil Dead trilogy. Very true. Evil Dead trilogy is very solid.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question. Yeah, because I start like trying to think of trilogies.
Lord of the Rings. Someone else said that. That's true. I don't really see Lord of the Rings as a trilogy, though, because they're all filmed at the same time. It's more like one gigantic movie.
Yeah, I don't know also. Like, honestly, I think Return of the King was like, that movie had like 20 endings.
It was too short. It was too short. That's what I thought about it.
Yeah. Well, then, Russell, I don't know if you've heard about these things, the extended editions, but believe me, you'll be in love.
Oh, yeah.
We'll carve out, comfy space on the couch next weekend because each one of them is 4 hours, so you'll be there for a while.
Yeah, and then of course, by the time he got to the Hobbit, like the first of those movies was literally longer than it would have taken to read out the Hobbit slowly, the entire book, taking occasional bathroom breaks.
Yeah, I know. I remember sitting there in theaters, and the whole time I was praying, like, don't be like the Star Wars prequel trilogy. Don't be like the Star Wars prequel trilogy. And then there was the wizard Radagast, and a bird came along and crapped on him, and it's kind of like a goofy moment. I'm like, oh, fuck. It's really too bad. But
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm definitely on the opposite team from Russell about this. Like, I thought, I think the best decision Peter Jackson made about any of those movies was cutting Tom Bombadil out of the first one. It's like, people complained about that, but it's like, guys, that would have been such a like ridiculous diversion for a movie. And like by the time they got to like, Return of the King, I could have sliced off like 40 minutes from that thing. Like pick an ending and end there.
Well, you say that in the original book, it doesn't actually end when they throw the ring in the fire, right? There's obviously that whole thing with the scouring of the Shire. So some people have complained and been like, "Well, why didn't he incorporate that? It's an important part of the book." I'm like, you want another fucking ending?
Every single sentence from this book.
They could have made a lot more. I mean, they made a ton of money, but they could have made even more if they did like a pick your ending before you go in, and then you have to go see it like 6 times to see all the different endings. So
And there's like the
Opportunity-
really exclusive one where Sauron wins. You know, the whole world is cast into darkness. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Let's see. Do Kant's critiques constitute a trilogy?
Definitely. Yeah.
I mean, he finished pretty strongly, I would say.
Yeah, I'd agree. There's not a weak one in there. What else? Is there like a philosophical trilogy? Ben, you must know. No. Is there like 3 books that go together in a trilogy-like manner in the history of European philosophy?
Well, I mean, the one we just talked about would be one, but yeah.
But aside from that, yeah.
Aside from that,
Capital.
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
I was just thinking about Capital, although it sort of doesn't count
It
because
doesn't really count. Yeah.
like the first is the only one that he actually signed off on the complete version of. God. Usually like the more typical thing is like the Godfather, where like the first one is fantastic and the second is still very good and the third one is an abortion.
It is. I mean, I've seen some people who try to defend it, but Francis Ford Coppola just released another cut of Godfather 3, and I'm like, look, he clearly also thinks it's crap. Why else is he editing it 30 years later, right? Like, if it's a good movie, he wouldn't have felt compelled to go back and been like, I promise you I can make some shit out of this, right?
Yeah, I didn't see the recut yet. Did anyone see it?
I haven't either. No,
I have not, and I mean I've seen Godfather 3 once, and I feel like I'm good.
Yeah, I think
one more time.
Exactly. Like the first, the first 2 I'm happy to see any number of times, but
I mean, I could even. I'm not saying I agree with this, but I could even make an argument for the second one. But the third one
for Godfather 2, yeah. But look,
I mean, for Godfather 2 being better, but I'm not saying I agree with that. But
yeah, I mean, there are lots of people who think that. I don't think I'm one of them, but there are lots of people who think that, and I get it. I mean, there's great stuff.
There's a lot of stuff in it. Yeah.
I mean, I love the Cuba stuff in Godfather 2.
Yeah.
Isn't it great to be in a country that respects free enterprise?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Godfather 1, though, I mean, that's got it. Like, that's one of those movies that, like, I can, I think I could, like, watch that and then, like, be over at somebody's house. They pop it on the next night. Oh, I'll watch that again.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, literally, this is going to be the most white boy thing I've ever seen. But back in my undergrad, we literally used to have it playing in the background, just at our regular, hangouts, because it was the one movie we could all agree on, right? Nobody would get pissed off. Nobody would fight about it.
That's ethnic. That's not white.
Okay, sure.
That's deep from the underbelly of Sicily. So
yeah, fair enough. I mean, I did as an undergrad. Like, I had like a little. It wasn't very big, but I had like a pile of VHSs that I would sort of alternate between like going to sleep watching, and that was definitely on there. So. Seen that like way too many times, but nevertheless, still willing to watch it any number of times in the future.
You didn't always you didn't get woken up when Apollonia is blown up. That would have woken me up.
I think that was actually where it was a 2 VHS set, and I think that was actually the cutoff point of the first one, if I'm remembering that right.
Yeah, I remember actually. I first bought it on DVD back in the 2000s, and the second one had 2 DVDs. One of them was like. It cut off around Cuba, and then you had to put the second DVD, and that was how fucking long it was, right?
Fair enough. Somebody says Camus' Absurds are a trilogy of sorts.
Oh, that's fair.
But well, anyway, before we got off on trilogies, the seamless transition I was trying for was that people, all of these like conservative and libertarian intellectuals on Twitter were upset about the idea that conservatism was all about defending hierarchy, which I think is. I mean, first of all, you're talking about Edmund Burke, who you've got
to be kidding me. I mean, Burke. I mean, yeah, I don't understand. Like, you see books. Matt, you probably know this book. Who's the author? Maybe it's an edited collection, but it's something like not American, but Conservatism from Burke to Bush or something like that.
That's Corey Robin's The Reactionary Mind.
The Reactionary Mind.
Okay.
It's a fantastic book, actually. Robin's I'm not sure if he's a democratic socialist, but he's definitely curious, right? And he said some supportive things about it. And the book is not favorable to conservatism. It's good. I mean, like, he's really analytical, cites his stuff, right?
Maybe I'm thinking of like an updated version of what's his name, Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind. But anyway, I don't understand how you could mistake Burke for. I mean, clearly he's also I like them to square not only the hierarchy but also the anti-capitalism. So
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, there is that to it, but which is actually part of Corey Robin's point, in that book. So the first edition was ended with, it was like reactionary mind, conservative something from Edmund Burke to Sarah Palin, and then the second edition swapped out Trump for Palin in the subtitle. But yeah, that's part of the point that he makes, that that he says, like, you can't really, if you're trying to like answer the sort of conceptual analysis question, what do all conservatisms have in common that makes them forms of conservatism? And one of the points he makes is like, well, it can't be attitudes towards capitalism because they don't all have that in common. It can't be attitudes towards, and like he goes through all these obvious things that it can't be, but what it certainly can be is attitudes towards hierarchy, towards, he has this whole analysis about how it's about a sense that you've lost power, that, traditional privileges are under threat. So anyway, it's a really good book, but
it is. It's very readable too. I mean, one of the things that sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna. Sorry, I found the one. It wasn't a Corey. I mean, I love Corey Robin. This was American Conservatism from Bush to Burke, Charles Dunn and David Woodward from 1991.
Oh, that one I haven't read. No, but
I'll skip it.
Yeah, one of the things that I liked about Robin, and actually I cited a favorite author of his, Mary Wollstonecraft, in the piece, because he points out, and I think this is very true, that one of the reasons he thinks conservatives are more successful in some respects than leftists is a lot of us try to write like Hegel, frankly, right? Very dense, evocative prose, particularly when responding to conservative authors. And his argument is we should try to write more like Mary Wollstonecraft, commenting on Edmund Burke, where in her text, The Rights of Man, she said, "You have a mortal antipathy to reason, right? You admire the rust of antiquity." And then she runs on to something like, "The ivy is indeed beautiful, but if it stagnates new growth, who would not cut it out?" Right? Just this lacerating satirical attack on the pseudo-profundities latent within his work. And it really kind of makes him look not quite silly, but a lot more underwhelming as a kind of towering, profound figure by the time it's done. And I think Robin accomplished something similar in The Reactionary Mind, right? By the time you're done reading it, definitely you'll come away with the conviction that a lot of conservatives are very smart, but you will definitely have your eyes open to some of the kind of pseudo-profundities and rhetorical devices that they use in place of rigorous argumentation.
Well, there's a segue.
There you go. There you go.
It is. Well, the original segue was just going to be Jordan Peterson's whole thing is very blatantly, transparently defense of hierarchy. But yes, that was also a very good segue. I should also very briefly say that since someone says thoughts on Palestine and Israel, that's as good an excuse as any to plug two things. One is an article that I wrote for Jacobin that came out yesterday. It's called Israel Doesn't Have a Right to Exist, but Israelis and Palestinians do. And that is so that's a sort of response to the usual talking point that's, advocating a secular democratic single state solution is wrong because, Israel has a right to exist. It's sort of trying to explore, do nation states, are they even the right kinds of entities to have rights, right? Like what sort of right are we talking about here? And the other is that I've got tomorrow. I should say that on the next regular episode of Give Them the Argument on Monday night, that is one of the two guests. So one of them is going to be Juliana Forlano from Act TV. But the other one is going to be Nora Bells-Friedman, who's the associate editor at the Electronic Intifada. So we will be talking, I'm sure, much more about all of that then. And also you can check out the live stream that we did here night before last, I want to say. A few nights ago, Wednesday night, with C. Derek Varn from Zero Books, and also, of course, our good friend, the historian Gene Bajalan, where we spent like a good couple hours talking about this. So if you want to if you want to hear what I think about all that, it is extensively available in many forms and media. But right now, we are not going to be talking about that. We are going to be watching. And by the way, I should say this is actually I guess one last plug before we do this, because when I was looking for that Israel-Palestine article to screen share, I just saw that my new piece apparently went up at Jacobin today, and they didn't tell me. So do better, Micah. But it's a preview for my book, and the title they gave the preview is "We Can't Cancel Ourselves into a Better World." So that's what that looks like.
We'll show you.
But in any case, speaking of people who think that we can't cancel our way into a better world, Slavoj Žižek was about to talk when we went last time. It's not as good a transition as those other two that we considered, but it's the one we're going to go with. So let's pick it up right there.
It's a sophisticated way of looking at the ways society could possibly be organized.
And I happen to believe that that has to happen at the individual level first. And that's the pathway forward that I see. And so that's my 10-minute commentary.
Yeah, I go up again. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Peterson. Dr. Žižek. I already spent a little bit of my time. I will try to be as short as possible. So a couple of remarks and then my final point. Why I think this self-limitation of capitalism is needed. First, about happiness. Just a couple of remarks. Jordan, I want to ask you, but isn't it, am I dreaming? I think I'm not. I remember a couple of years ago, it was reported all around the world, some kind of a investigation, percentage of people interviewed in different countries, do they feel happy with their life? And the shock was that some Scandinavian countries, which we considered social democratic paradise, were very low, while Bangladesh, I think, was close to the top. Now, I know this logic has a limit. I don't buy the bullshit of poor people are happy in their world there and so on. But you know, my argument here is not against you. My argument here is problematizing happiness even more. Look, this may interest you. I was years ago in I think, Lithuania, and we debated, I report on this in one of my books, when were people in some perverted sense, and this is the critique of the category of happiness for me, happy. And we came to the crazy result. After the Soviet intervention, Czechoslovakia in 1970s and 80s. Why? For happiness, first, you should not have too much democracy, because this brings the burden of responsibility. Happiness means there is another guy out there, you can put all the blame on him. And as the joke went in Czechoslovakia, if there is bad weather, a storm, oh, this communist screwed it up again. That's one condition of happiness. The other condition, much more subtle one, is, and this was done in Czechoslovakia, those dark times after Soviet, the life was relatively moderately good, but not perfect. Like there was meat all the time. Maybe once a month there was not meat in the stores. It was very good to remind you how happy you are the other time. Another thing, they had a paradise which should be at a proper distance. West Germany, affluence. It was not too far, but not directly accessible. You know, so it was so. Maybe in your critique of communist regimes, I agree with you. You should more focus on something that I experience. Of, you know, don't look only at the terror, ultimately totalitarian regime. There was a kind of a silent, perverted pact between at least in this late, a little bit more tolerant, but I still oppose them, communist regimes between power and population. The message was, leave us the power, don't mess with us, and we guarantee you a relatively safe life, employment, private pleasures, private niche, and so on and so on. So I am not surprised. But again, this is not for me the argument for the communists, but against happiness. That, people said when the wall fell down, what a wonder in Poland. My God, in like Solidarność, which was prohibited a year ago, now triumphed at the elections. Who could imagine this? Yes, but the true miracle, in a bad sense for me, was 4 years later, democratically ex-communists came back to power. So, again, this is for me not the argument for them, but simply for the, let's call it, corruptive nature of happiness. So my formula, maybe you would agree with it, is my basic dogma is happiness should be treated as a necessary byproduct. If you focus on it, you are lost. It comes as a byproduct of you working for a cause and so on. That's the basic thing for me. Second point, maybe we disagree here. China, of course, the miracle, economic miracle was due to unleashing market reform and so on. But, and here comes my pessimism. Some of my liberal friends are telling me, yes, imagine what would they have achieved with also political democratization. I'm a pessimist here. No, they found a perfect formula of how. And that's the paradox of China today. The Communist Party is the best manager of capitalism and protector against workers. The truly dangerous thing in China today is not to flirt with Western ideas, is to organize trade unions, this is what worries me. This perfect combination between unleashing capitalism and still the authoritarian rule, or to put it in another way, my worry is that today, all around the world, eternal marriage between capitalism and democracy is slowly disappearing. Till now, I admit it, capitalism needed from time to time some 10, 20 years of dictatorship. When things started to improve, democracy returned. Chile, South Korea, and so on. I wonder if we are still at that. Now, just very quickly, your basic point in the introduction, in your introduction. I'm tempted to say, the way you presented Communist Manifesto, the simplified image, and so on and so on, it's crazy to say, but on many points, I agree with you, and it's a very complex argument. Marx didn't have, for example, a good theory of how social power exists. His idea was simply with disappearance of class structure. It's secretly, although he wouldn't have accepted it, a technocratic dream. Like, by experts, social life will be run as a perfect machine. Although he was at least aware of the problem, which is why he was so enthusiastic, Marx, about Paris Commune, which was precisely not centralized power. So I'm not just defending Marx. I'm saying it was not clear to him. And so let's drop that. Maybe I have more interesting.
We just pause for 1 second.
Okay.
I just wanted to do a plug for a friend of mine's book, Revisiting Marx's Critique of Liberalism by Igor Shukabroad, which was released with Palgrave Macmillan just about 2 years ago. I wrote a review of it for Jacobin that people can take a look at if they're interested. But sorry, it's a fantastic.
I think I remember your review, but yeah, please go on.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. But one of the points that he makes is that the expectation that Marx saw communism as being defined by technocracy, right, rule by management, actually is a view that we can associate with a Soviet Marxist instead. In particular, what's his name? I'm just pulling it up here. Patrikianis, that's the one. Yeah. Where Patrikianis argued in his book on Marxist legality that with the end of class society, we'd see politics replaced by science or management, right? Chuck Brad points out in his book that you can't actually find references to these kind of ideas in Marx's own work, which is a lot more in line with the spirit of something like the Critique of Gotha Program, right? The idea that there'd be a democratic form of life, but it would still be highly politicized. We wouldn't see the supersession of politics by management. So I just want to make a plug for my friend's book and also point out that I think Žižek might actually be wrong here, or at least misreading elements of the Marxist text.
Yeah,
I was just going to add that this is one of the rare instances in this debate where I disagree with Slavoj, or I think that he could have handled that part a bit differently. I think he was granting a little bit too much to Peterson.
Yeah,
I do think, and I don't want this to be entirely a pile on. Like, I do think that Peterson occasionally has some interesting things to say about happiness, but the problem is that he ends up just sort of making these uncritical sort of what's the word I'm looking for? These sort of like grand, profound statements that actually don't have much behind them once you scratch beneath the surface. But this is one instance where I think that, I would say that I think Slavoj is granting too much to Peterson here. I don't think there's not much in that reading of Peterson's reading of the Communist Manifesto, even if, you want to critique the manifesto that lines, or, I would agree with or say is correct.
Yeah. I don't know. I think I might actually be halfway between Slavoj and you guys on this one. I do think, of course, look, Peterson's critique is totally wrong, but I think in a way Žižek is doing here like what a really good classroom teacher does, where sometimes if you've anybody who's watching this who's ever been in one of my classes, I'm not talking about you, but sometimes like students in an introductory class will just like babble incoherent things in class discussion, and like what like the best classroom teachers do is they find a way to reinterpret it as something more coherent than what the student said. So it's like, okay, so I think what you're saying is, and then you sort of translate it to something that's actually way better than what they said, but they're so confused they kind of accept that, and then you go forward from there.
It's a good pedagogical move. Yeah, I think there is a little bit of that going on. Yeah,
it's often much more productive than like trying to take apart like exactly what they actually said. So. Right. And I think that maybe he's doing that a little bit because like I don't really think that Peterson was saying what he just said, but I think that there is maybe like, and I certainly don't think it's fair to read this into the Communist Manifesto, but like I do think maybe there are parts of Marx and Engels where I think they do where they do seem to indicate something like what Žižek is criticizing here, and I remember Matt's review of the book. I haven't read the book yet. I should read the book. That sounds super interesting. But and so I would imagine probably in Matt's friend's book, he's like picking up on other passages in Marx and Engels that maybe complicate the readings of the first ones. But there are places where they say things like the rule of man over man will be, replaced with a neutral administration of things. And I don't really buy that, right? Like I think that you're going to have politics in any conceivable human society. I think the idea that just because society is no longer divided into economic classes, that therefore you're not going to have ideological rifts and like struggles that are going to be best described as like, struggles for the rule of man over man. Like, I just don't buy that. Because like any kind of political, it's very, I remember my friend Lee Phillips, the guy who co-wrote the People's Republic of Walmart, made this point to me in conversation about this once. Like, it's very easy to imagine an advanced classless socialist society having an intense debate about whether to like have a space program or expand the space program or just to like concentrate all those resources on Earth. That's totally easy to imagine, and that's a political battle that, so there are at least places where Marx and Engels, I think, are a little, probably a little too utopian about that.
Oh, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, you can find places in Marx and Engels where they're you know a little bit too utopian or too sort of like naively utopian, but I think what's going on here, and I didn't even realize it, but I think I think you're right, Ben, that this was like sort of seeding or like reinterpreting kind of what he's kind of like granting Peterson. Okay, let's grant him that this was the critique that Peterson was putting forth of the Communist Manifesto when it really wasn't.
Right.
But it's a way of bringing people. Look, like I was sitting in the room, and Peterson was clearly the hometown. You know, he had a home field advantage basically. And when you showed up, there were a lot of people who, you know, had Peterson's book and were even dressed like Peterson. And I'm not lying.
That's awesome. Jordan Peterson cosplay.
And then, well, I mean, there were, I did see a few people who had like Žižek beards, which was weird, and someone had a Žižek foam finger that they made. Like, yeah, it's indelibly printed on my mind. But the way that he was able, Žižek was able to sway some of Peterson's audience, or maybe a good deal of it, because actually the applause ended up being pretty even. But also, you know, maybe we'll talk about this later. Peterson himself was you know, brought along to a certain degree by what Žižek was saying.
Oh yeah, you could tell. I mean, just watching it, you know, like the video. That, I mean, that was definitely my impression at the time, that Peterson seemed like shaken by it, like, and he seemed to be like finding at least bits and pieces of it compelling. I'm not giving his subsequent, you know, life pronouncements. I'm not sure if anything stuck, but yeah, I think that's right. This, by the way, is the article. Well, this is Matt's review of it in Jacobin, the book that he mentioned. So but the book itself. So the review is called "What Karl Marx Really Thought About Liberalism," and the book itself is called "Revisiting Marx's Critique of Liberalism: Rethinking Justice, Legality, and Rights." Which, yeah, I mean, that would be right up my alley. I should definitely read that book.
I know Igor would really appreciate your thoughts, because he's a really good guy, very solid. But yeah, I want to say just one thing about Ben's point, which is there's a big debate in the literature about this, right? But the kind of general narrative is that once upon a time, Orthodox Marxists presumed that at a certain point, the mode of production would be so developed that we'd have the capacity to produce a superabundance of goods. So ultimately, the kind of distributive political questions that racked so much of earlier society would just be negated. Putting it really simply, we'd have so much of everything that we wouldn't need to ask questions like, well, where should we allocate resources? Because we live in a Star Trek universe, right, with replicators and so on.
Yeah, right.
But, you know, people have pointed out that the idea of superabundance just is actually conceptually incoherent, right? Because you're always going to be existing in context of limited scarcity, where even if you happen to have a lot of something, you're still going to have to make choices about where you're going to commit your resources. You know, we could live in an extremely rich society and still have to ask ourselves, do we invest $200 billion in healthcare, or as Ben put it, do we invest $200 billion trying to get to Mars, right? We can throw a lot of resources at both problems, maybe, but we still have to ask ourselves those questions.
Totally. And I should say, just even like go to like a city council meeting or something sometime to try to get a sense of this, like just the kind of mundane things that like really petty levels of government deal with all the time. I still think are politics and not just like neutral administration. Like even if like, you know, like the city wants to run a cable that's gonna like go through your yard or something like that, and you're fighting about that. I mean, sorry guys, that's politics. I mean, that's like, you know, like different people whose interests are coming into conflict, and they, you know, and they're going to make different arguments, you know, for like why their side should prevail. And, you know, like it's also totally like you can imagine a classless socialist society where like there was still like, I don't think drug addiction, for example, would cease to be a problem, right? There are plenty of economically comfortable people who have drug problems in the world.
Some of the acid left people might actually think that's a good thing, right?
Yeah. Well, sure. I mean, but like, look, I'm not a, you know, I don't think I've ever claimed to abstain, you know, but from some things, right? But but look, there are plenty of economically comfortable people who have had their lives ruined by drug problems. That happens in the society that we live in right now. I see no reason to believe that under socialism it would magically stop happening, right? Like that, like, oh, like this, well, see, no more alienation, therefore nobody has, nobody feels vaguely dissatisfied with their life. I don't buy that, right? So, like I was talking about this in a different context earlier today when I was recording the Patriot Modus episode with Nick Manley. It's like I often feel like, I don't know, like when I read Che Guevara talking about the new socialist man, or like even Trotsky and his like more like poetically utopian moments, I'm like, I don't know. This seems really implausible to me, and I don't really get the need for this. Like, do you really need to believe in these like dramatic changes to humans in order to like, get excited about ending war and poverty and stuff? I don't, but like, assuming that drug problems are still going to be a problem, I don't see any reason to believe that classless society couldn't still have ideological battles over how like libertarian or puritanical to be about that.
No, of course. No, I totally agree. Yeah.
Anyway, I am very glad that Slavoj mentioned the Paris Commune, because I think the first time I watched the opening, like Peterson's opening statement, I was probably screaming Paris Commune at the screen, because that bothered me so much that Peterson was reaching into, even though, as we mentioned before, the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat doesn't even come in the Communist Manifesto. Communist Manifesto, it's like winning the battle for democracy, right? Those are the kinds of phrases that are used there. But like Peterson is still talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat in his book report on the Communist Manifesto at the beginning. And he's talking about it in a way that assumes that means a one-party or even one-man dictatorship. And that's just not right. Like they Marx and Engels, the few times they use that phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, they actually say, look, here's our real world model, the Paris Commune, which was this ultra democratic experiment where every official could be paid no more than the average salary of a skilled worker. Every official could be recalled by their constituents at any time for any reason. Judges were elected, and whatever you think about that as a model, like it's just like the idea that, oh, dictatorship of the proletariat, that means like Stalinist dictatorship, I mean, just strikes me as really historically illiterate. So I'm just really happy that, Slavoj at least put the phrase Paris Commune into the ears of,
I mean, the Cold War is doing a lot of ideological work insofar as it makes, it turns communism and democracy into polar opposites, or into contention, when that's certainly not how Marx and Engels, theorized it or planned for it or understood it.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think that it's, I don't know. I mean, it's just kind of lazy. It's like that's like the cheapest way to make a anti-Marxist argument, is to sort of like bring out the cardboard cutout of Stalin from the 1950s and wave it around. Oh, look. All right.
I mean, I'm not going to be able to get that image out of my head for a long time.
That's what Slavoj does on his weekends.
Yeah.
So, I mean, come on.
I can actually sort of imagine that. All right. Yeah, I kind of want to see that as like an SNL skit now. But in any case, let's go back to the debate.
Another point, nonetheless, at one point I'm ready to claim, where did you find this? This goes maybe for today's politically correct jerks and so on, that this egalitarianism. There is one passage in his late critique of Gotha program where Marx directly accesses the problem of equality. And he dismisses it as a strict bourgeois category. Explicitly. For him, communism is not egalitarianism. It's, yes, hierarchies, but not based on capitalism. Okay, I'm not totally defending here Marx. I'm just saying, don't refer this to Marx. Okay, but to conclude, because yes, I want to keep my promise to be a little bit shorter. You know, I agree with you on many points, but you know what? My problem with my problem that I was aiming at. With all the openings, I know we don't know really what is happening with ecology and so on. And this is okay, let's take oceans. You mentioned them. But isn't it, for me, correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't mean this rhetorically, maybe I'm really wrong, but the problem of oceans, the only way for me is some kind of cooperated international action and so on. You cannot simply leave it to the market. That's what I'm saying. This is the faithful limit that I see. About this diminishing poverty and so on, I am aware of it. I tend to agree with it. But I at the same time see so many explosive tensions. For example, do you know about South Africa? It's a terrifying situation on the edge of the civil war. To be very brutal, the only thing that, I'm simplifying it, that really happened with end of apartheid is that the old ruling class, I simplified in grotesque Marxist terms, was joined by a new black ruling class, which is not doing a good job, so they are trying to play the race card. It's still the consequence of white colonialism and so on and so on. But tensions are terrifying. And here I was pleading for not abolishing borders and so on, but this type of, I don't know how to put it, global change, cooperation, like, again, the example of Congo that I mentioned, or like, forget the killing of that guy Khashoggi. It's horrible, but the true nightmare is Yemen today. I mean, you said somewhere that we should well think without engaging in large-scale reform what the consequences will be. If you, okay, very briefly, I agree with you that the gap of standard Marxism
was that the proletarian revolution will be a place where you do something and you know exactly what you do. If there is a lesson of the 20th century, is that this tragic logic, you want something maybe good, the result is catastrophic, holds absolutely also for revolutions and so on and so on. But in spite of all this, and I don't know what forum will it have. I'm not pleading for a new Leninist party or whatever. I'm just pleading for new forums of international cooperation and so on. I agree with you when you said the majority of us is not even really aware of the seriousness of, especially the poor, of ecological problems and so on. And I think, would you agree that the situation is here much more subtle and obscene? It's that logic that in psychoanalysis is called disavowal, Verleugnung. In French, je sais bien, mais quand même. We know ecological problems, but we don't really take them seriously. And here I see problems and I don't see an easy way out. I am a pessimist, if you ask me. When people say, no, but they are growing, protests are growing, and so on and so on. Yes, I'm listening to this story from when I was young, you know. They are growing, and then look what happened. The mega tragedy is, for me, for example, what happened to Syriza. They were elected for change, whatever, and they become, and I'm not blaming them, they become the perfect executors of austerity program. So I just see problems. I'm a pessimist, and I'm not a radical pessimist, but you have to, maybe here we are different. I noticed with your final speech, that final moment of your intervention, that it's very strange, because usually Marxists have this stupid optimist anthropology. Just get rid of capitalist terror and we will all be happy. My God, I'm much more a pessimist. I don't believe in human goodness. Never underestimate evil, never underestimate envy. I mean, it's part of my nature. In Slovenia, we have a wonderful story. godlike figure comes to a farmer, and I will stop immediately, and asks,
Here we go.
I will do to you whatever you want. Just I warn you, I will do twice the same to your neighbor. You know what Slovene farmer answers? Fine, take one of my eyes. You know, we are in this. Don't underestimate this. I don't see any simple, clear way out.
All right.
One of my favorite lobster roasts. That's great.
But that was the joke that Matt, you were talking about last time. By the way, if anyone is interested in a further development of that point about disavowal, fetishistic disavowal, which is a psychoanalytic concept, particularly, I mean, he linked it there to ecology. So particularly with regard to ecology, I can't remember if I talked about this last time or if I referenced it, but or if we were talking about it either before or after we started. But Žižek's section in the Asher Taylor film Examined Life is 10 minutes of it's all gold. And he makes this very same point, but in much greater depth about fetishistic disavowal and how that sort of psychic phenomenon can be applied to how we deal with ecology or don't deal with ecological catastrophes.
Oh, that's interesting. So what's the argument there?
I mean, the argument is essentially, so the formula for fetishistic disavowal, and this comes from the psychoanalyst Octave Manani, who sat in on some of, he attended many of Lacan's seminars, but he says the formula is, I know very well, but all the same. And so what Žižek talks about there is, we know very well that there's an impending ecological crisis. I mean, it's already started in a lot of ways, but we leave the house, we see the sky is blue, the birds are outside, and we're not cognitively built in order to actually accept this. And so we act as though, even though we know very well that, the catastrophe is on the horizon, we act as though everything is fine as a way of actually dealing with that, that prospect.
Right. Yeah, no, that's interesting. That makes sense. Kind of reminds me of like the way something that always drives me crazy about economists, or at least, I don't know, maybe a certain kind of neoclassical economist who likes this revealed preferences talk, where you say, you start with decision theory, which is like fine as normative theory about what people should do if they're actually making careful, rational decisions. But then you go in the opposite direction and you just start from the assumption that everybody is doing that. And so therefore you can like work backwards from their decisions to see like what goals they care about and like what they believe the probability of some outcome is. And so like economists who are in love with this will say like, oh, don't pay attention to people's stated preferences, pay attention to their revealed preferences. Which, well, they say they don't want, lung cancer, but, they have a few cigarettes over the course of the night or whatever. And that just seems like, I don't know, anybody with 5 minutes acquaintance with what human beings are like should know better than that. Like, we don't, we're not making like perfectly rational decisions about how much we would hate some outcome or, how much we want some other outcome. In fact, oftentimes, if you're really terrified of some outcome, it makes you want to not think about it, which actually might make you less rational about doing things to avoid it.
Yeah. I mean, the Lacanian point, to go back to like the cigarette example, would be that on some level, because it's harmful, that's why you engage in it. Right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. That's part of the appeal or the enjoyment behind it, is knowing the damage you're doing to yourself while you puff away.
I did want to say though that I do think that Peterson would actually agree with his position. Actually, one of the interesting things about Maps of Meaning and 12 Rules for Life is he's not afraid of autobiographical ruminations. And he says, sadly, that one of the reasons he actually transitioned from being a supporter of a kind of moderate democratic socialism, a la the New Democratic Party in Canada, to becoming, the man he is today, is because he disliked the fact that leftists around him tended to attribute everything to the economy, right? And he thought that people's actual motivations were more complex than that. So I think we could grant at that point. But I really...
Yeah. No. Sorry. Go ahead, Matt. Finish.
Sure. No, I just want to do a plug for a book that I just finished. That's actually really excellent. I've been meaning to read it for years, and I finally got around to it. But it's Robert Heilbronner's *The Worldly Philosophers: The Lies, Times, and Ideas of the Great Economic Thinkers*. So, for people who don't know, Heilbronner was a democratic socialist writer who wrote a very well-known history of economic thought, very accessible. But one of the most fascinating chapters in it concerns the Victorian era, where he talks and actually refers to Marx about how it is that in order to mathematize the discipline of economics, economists were forced to kind of get rid of all those irrational human impulses Ben was talking about, largely because they say, well, if we give too much to those, then we can't make predictive models. And since we have to make predictive models for this to be a science, all that's got to go. And Heilbronner points out that if you look at classical political economy, people like Marx or Ricardo or Malthus or even Adam Smith, one of their virtues was the fact that these people weren't afraid of those. They recognized that they're parts of human nature, if you want to use that cheesy term. And you got to deal with them as a political economist, right? It's really quite a fascinating story. And so if people are interested in this, I strongly recommend they take a look at that book.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. It's pretty clear, I think, to all of us that you both have quite a bit to say to each other. And so...
And to ourselves.
And,
Monologues, yes.
and so I think before we jump to some audience questions, I thought it would be nice to give each of you a chance to ask a response or ask a question or two from each other. So starting with you, Dr. Peterson.
Maybe you want simply to counterattack. It wasn't fair to...
Well, I've only...
To do your reply.
I had 3 questions, and 2 of them are now completely irrelevant. And so I have 1 left, I guess. And I'm not sure that it's a fair question, but maybe it seems to me to be a fair question. Okay. You're a strange Marxist to have a discussion with. And well, but here's why. This is not an insult by any stretch of the imagination. No. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I was looking at your work was that well, first of all, you're a character, you know, and that's an interesting thing. Like
Is this an insult?
That's the truest thing I think he's ever said.
It's a sign of originality, and it's a sign of a certain amount of moral courage, and it's a sign of a certain temperament, and it makes you humorous and charismatic and attractive, and I think you appeal to young people the way that outside intellectual rebels appeal to young people. And so those are all positive things that can be used positively or negatively. And my question is, like, it seems to me that your reputation, unless I'm very misinformed about this, is as a strong supporter of Marxist doctrines on the left, or was that? And so then my question is, given the originality of your thought, why is it that you came to presume at some point in your life, perhaps not now and perhaps still, that the promotion of Marxism rather than Zizekism was appropriate? Because it seems to me that there's enough originality in your body of thought and lateral thinking in the manner in which you approach intellectual ideas that there's just no reason for you to be allied with a doctrine that's 170 years old and that is, if capitalism is rife with problems, is twice as rife with problems as that. And so you're kind of a mystery to me in that way. And so that's my question.
Okay.
Man, that was hot.
Very briefly, I developed systematically in my book critical insights into many traditional Marxist theses. So no doubt here, you know what I still admire nonetheless in Marx? Not those simplicities of Communist Manifesto, but I still think that his so-called critique of political economy, capital, and so on, is a tremendous achievement as a description of the dynamics of capitalist society. And if you read it closely, Marx is much more ambiguous and open there. For example, he mentions, for example, apropos what you referred to, he mentions that law of diminishing return, like why crisis will arrive necessarily, poorer getting poorer. But then he is honest enough to enumerate 7 or 8 counter tendencies. And if you read him closely, you will see that precisely those tendencies prevailed later. Or forget Communist Manifesto, go to read his political analysis of its unsurpassable 18 Brumaire and so on of the 1848 revolution, which are incredibly complex, no traces of that class binary there. Marx deals with middle classes with crucial, lumpen proletariat with the ambiguous role of intellectuals and so on and so on. But basically, what I was pleading for, and I like to put it in paradoxical terms, was for a return from Marx back to Hegel. I define myself more as a Hegelian. Why? Hegel is considered a madman, you know, the guy absolutely.
Let me just pause there for a second.
So on. No, Hegel is much more.
I had a profoundly unimportant statement, which was that I think that is the loudest I have ever heard anyone cheer for a philosopher. And I would never have expected to hear that philosopher who gets that kind of applause be Hegel. Never would have expected it, right? Like, soon enough, the phenomenology of spirit is going to be right up there with 12 Rules for Life, just selling like hotcakes.
Well, they're just as easy to read. I mean, come on.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's my niche reading.
Observing reason is much like rule. What are we on now? Rule 2018? Where are we on?
I think there's 24 now. Yeah, there's 12 rules, then there's 12 rules more, and I'm sure since the latest book is successful, that will probably get 12 more rules, right?
That's the trilogy, 25 to 36.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. 36 rules.
That's a lot of rules. This is like getting this is getting to be like some like really complicated system of like it's going to be like Orthodox Judaism, they're getting off like the codes of Jordan Peterson law, that you have to figure out all the strictures and how they fit together, and there'll be different interpretation. Well, but what about how does Rule 37 fit with with Rule 11? Is there a problem here? You have to get the man himself in to give rulings about it.
He's the ultimate adjudicator.
I would assume that ultimate adjudicator. I don't think you would let anybody else be the ultimate adjudicator.
Modest and open. The danger in Marxism is, for me, this teleological structure. We are at the 0 point, but there is a unique chance of a reversal into a new emancipated society and so on. And the danger here is that of self-instrumentalization. Proletarian Communist Party is an agent of history which knows the laws of history, to put it, follows them, and so on. That's the catastrophe. In Hegel, such a position is strictly prohibited. In Hegel, whenever you act, you err. So, you have to, there is no position of this pure acting where you know what you are doing.
Can you mute yourself?
Will be so. This would be my main point. So yes, my formula is kind of ironically, I know Hegel is the greatest idealist, materialist reversal of Marx by turning back to Hegel. For Hegel says in a part that people don't read.
Could we pause for a second?
Forward, sorry.
I actually had a serious question that I wanted to ask you. And Russell, I imagine you'll have a lot to say about this. But my friend Borna Radnick, who's a Hegel scholar, just wrapping up his thesis, which is very smart, is kind of a Marxist Hegelian. And he made the auspicious claim that Marx's misreading of Hegel is indeed a misreading, but it was the most productive misreading of anyone in the history of philosophy. So we can forgive him for that, right? And I'm genuinely wondering whether or not people think that that's true, because once upon a time, in no small part thanks to Marx and the efforts of the young Hegelians, there was this kind of vision of Hegel as a cheesy idealist, the philosopher of the absolute, who began as a kind of soft revolutionary, but ended his career talking about how the Prussian state was going to be eternal, right? I think now we've shifted gears a little bit, and so this kind of Marxist reading of Hegel is less popular than it once was. But, you know, I'm a little bit persuaded by it, in no small part because I think while people like Žižek have done a great job of refitting Hegel for more radical purposes, I think if you go back to those earlier texts, he does sometimes write like a pretty conservative guy. I'm just wondering what you guys think.
No, I think that's accurate. But I think that, you know, Hegel, I would say, I mean, a lot of philosophers are misread, but I would say more so than most others. A friend of mine, Todd McGowan, published a book on Hegel, I think close to 2 years ago now. And I think he starts the book off with this claim, you know, of course it's typical for philosophers to be misread, but Hegel is, you have, you know, left Hegelians, right Hegelians, and it's a completely different Hegel. And one of the things that,
like Roger Scruton's Hegel has very little to do with Slavoj Žižek.
Absolutely. And, you know, if you go back and read Hegel, for instance, here's a great misreading of Hegel. You will find thesis, antithesis, synthesis nowhere in Hegel. It doesn't exist. It was made up after the fact and sort of retroactively mapped onto Hegel. That's not to say that there aren't parts in Hegel's thought where he appears to be moving from thesis, antithesis, and then a sort of reconciliation between those two entities leads to a synthesis. But more often than not, it's like, you know, I don't want to go down a huge Hegel rabbit hole here, but more often than not, it's like the thesis, the antithesis isn't so much an external pressure as it is an internal one. So the antithesis is actually built into the, you know, to the thesis. So I think that Borna, who has a piece, by the way, in
oh yeah, you guys are friends. That's right.
The collection that Slavoj and I put together that was published like literally about a week before the pandemic. So this book, Subject Lessons, Hegel, Lacan, and the Future of Materialism, and Borna has a very good chapter in there on Hegel and to some degree Marx. I think the last section is about Marx, but yeah,
I think ask him for this. I don't think I've read this.
Yeah, I can send you a PDF. I think that's right. I would agree with that. That the reading of Marx, or Marx's reading of Hegel, pretty much like everyone that read Hegel back then, I mean, even now, it was a misreading, but an incredibly productive misreading. And I think that Žižek actually has this argument somewhere that all great philosophical advancements are based upon misreadings of previous philosophers. He throws that out somewhere. I don't think he says it here, but he said that before, at least on a few occasions.
Yeah, I should also say our friend Ekin Erikin says one of the best books on Marx's misrendering is William Maker's Philosophy Without Foundations. So Ekin is a smart guy, knows a lot. Like, I'm actually always amazed by how much he seems to know about how many different areas of philosophy. So
it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah. So probably a good recommendation there. I don't know. I mean, my own understanding of Hegel is like super shaped by the first chapter of G.A. Cohen's Karl Marx's Theory of History, which might be a misreading too, but I'm really reluctant to let it go because Cohen is so good at like distilling down what he takes Hegel to be saying to these like very clear arguments. And so I'd be really disappointed if he's getting it all wrong. But that's the secondary source I would recommend. I don't know. I need to. I read a bunch of Hegel a long time ago, but I'm sure I was reading it through the through the prism of the sort of usual Marxist reading of Hegel, and I was just kind of assuming that, and I'm sure that all all of my perceptions were kind of filtered through that. So someday when I'm not reading a bunch of other things for different writing projects, I don't know what that day is going to be, when that day is going to come, but when it does, I should go back and reread some of that.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in very briefly. First off, in saying, you heard it here first. We have the definitive reading of Hegel here. Ours will supersede all others, and you should be convinced ours from here on in. So there's just that. But my own interpretation of Hegel is very much inspired by American readings, particularly people like Robert Brandom. what's sometimes now called, I still think bewilderingly, analytical Hegelianism or Pittsburgh Hegelianism.
Pittsburgh, yeah.
Yeah, which tends to see him very much in line with the kind of reformist spirit of American pragmatism, right? But personally, I don't really think it's important to show a lot of fidelity to what Hegel himself actually meant any longer, because like all great philosophers, he belongs to history, as he himself would have appreciated. And I sometimes think that the most creative and interesting engagements with his work are those like Žižek's, which are quite violent, right? Where I sometimes think, I don't know that Hegel himself believes this or would have argued for this, but nonetheless, it's a very interesting kind of take on his work that strikes me as a lot more vital than, say, a more dogmatic reading would be, right? Because on the kind of dogmatic point, I actually do think that a conservative reading, certainly of Hegel's late period, is broadly correct, right? If you read The Philosophy of Right, he does sound a lot like a kind of ordered liberty conservative, arguing for the importance of social institutions, the monarchy, even to a certain extent, the capitalist state. And so when somebody like Scruton reads him as affirming something like traditionalism in this book, it's not a misreading, right? But I think the way that to counteract that would be to draw upon somebody like Žižek to say, look, Hegel might have actually taken a wrong turn in applying his own thought via this book. And what we need to do is, in some sense, be more faithful to its spirit than he himself was in his later periods. And that's where the creative, violent reading comes in. So that's just my own take.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think Žižek would agree with that. And by the way, speaking of Brandom, Žižek has a co-authored book coming out, I think later this year, called Reading Hegel, and his chapter is a critique of Brandom called a spirit of distrust or a spirit of mistrust, like a play on the subtitle of Brandom's 1,000-page Hegel book.
Cool. All right.
1,000 pages. That's gonna be that's a bore stud.
Well, Brandom's book is that book is 1,000 pages, I think.
I reviewed it for Historical Materialism. It's really good, but fuck is it to read? I just remember looking at this because Brandom is a difficult writer, and then you throw Hegel in on top of this, and there were points where I was just reading a sentence, and I'm like, give it to me again. Yeah. I would tell my wife, this is what he said here, and she'd just be like, what the fuck does that even mean? It's like, God if I knows. I'll mull it over in the afternoon and get back to you. Still a really good book, though. People should check it out.
Fair enough. All right, let's get back to it.
To Philosophy of Right, he says explicitly that the owl of Minerva takes off in the evening when there is dusk. So philosophy can just grasp a social order when it's already in its decay. Philosophy cannot see into the future. It's radical openness. We need this openness today. The tragedy today, maybe we agree here, is that we really don't have a basic, how should I call it, cognitive mapping. I don't think we have here a clear insight into where we stand, where we are moving, and so on and so on. So I'm much more, again, sincerely of a pessimist.
Please, reply.
Can I ask you now a question?
Let me respond, and then you can ask me.
Yeah, of course.
So,
sorry.
Well, I don't have anything to quibble about with what you just said.
But.
Well, no, there's not even a but really. It's that even if what you said about Marx's more sophisticated thought is true, I think the unfortunate reality is that any support for Marxism, especially directed towards those who are young, is likely to be read as support for the most radical and revolutionary proclivities. And I would say that as they're outlined in the document that I described, in the Communist Manifesto, that they're of extraordinary danger. And so it seems to me that by attempting to, rescue the sheep, you've sort of invited the dragon into the house. And that seems to me to be dangerous and unfortunate.
Here I can answer you by asking you my question. Because, very naively, you mentioned, Mark, first, where did you find the data that I simply don't see it? Okay, let me begin by this. You designate your
under quotation marks, I'm not characterizing here, enemy, or what you
are fighting against, as sometimes you call it postmodern neo-Marxism.
I know what you mean. All this, from political correctness to these excesses of whatever spirit of envy and so on and so on. Do you think they are really, where did you find this data? I don't know them. I would ask you here, give me some names or whatever. Where are the Marxists here? I don't know any. Who is the Marxist here? Well, show me any big names.
This was easily the most beautiful moment of the debate.
I think they fear like a good vampire fears garlic. This is why they are already the one who is not a Marxist, but at least approaches economic topic. Bernie Sanders, he's already under attack as white male and all that stuff and so on. My problem would be with this one. What you describe as postmodern neo-Marxism, where is really the Marxist element in it? They are for equality. Sorry, where? They are for equality at these cultural struggles, proper names, how do we call each other? Do you see in them, in political correctness and so on, any genuine will to change society? I don't see it. I think it's a hyper-moralization, which is a silent admission of a defeat. That's my problem. Why do you call?
I just say something here because this is actually kind of a moving moment for me. The thing that got me into Žižek right from the get-go when I first read his books was actually this kind of argument, which I found exceptionally intriguing. Because I remember in his book, I think it was The Ticklish Subject, but I might be wrong, where he characterized the contemporary left as all closet Fukuyamists, in the sense that we all like to contend that, this argument that liberal capitalism is the only game in town is obviously wrong, but secretly we all believe that, and we're unwilling to actually accept that there could be any radical change to society, certainly not one that we can conceive of. And I just thought this was the most fascinating kind of argument in the world, and it really echoed a lot of what I saw in the radical left circles that I was starting to move in. So I think this is really a great point. Right? It's very, very intriguing, and he's done a fantastic job.
Well, this
packing in many different works.
Well, this was what when we had Slavoj on a couple of weeks ago. This is what I meant when I said, because I think that when he says to Peterson, "I know what you mean," I don't think that he's just throwing him a bone there or being trying to lure him in. I think he's right. The academy is filled with liberals who think that they are Marxists, or and I also know what he means in Peterson in a way, because you'll see in his answer, he kind of says, well, they've taken the oppressor-oppressed, dialectic and have mapped sort of identity onto it. And I think that's absolutely true. But Slavoj's point here is that this is not remotely Marxist, right? It's not Marxist in the least, because rather than actually being some sort of revolutionary change, it literally just upholds and maintains the status quo. And so I totally agree that this is the high watermark of the debate, along with Peterson's response, which we'll see, and then Žižek's rebuttal or rejoinder.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to Josh Hawley or Marco Rubio, it's Amazon and big tech that are actually the Marxists now, right?
Right.
Yeah, right. Which does show something there. It's also, sure. I mean, I know what he means when he says he knows what Peterson means, but at the same time, I don't know. I mean, just having some sort of category of one group oppressing another group, that's such a low bar of similarity. The idea that oppression and injustice exist predates Karl Marx by all of human history. We're all the French revolutionaries Marxists. We're, the authors of, the Book of Exodus Marxists. I'm pretty sure. That's.
I mean, Moses had the beard for it,
Yeah, that's true. That's true. He did have that, like, yeah. I mean, although nobody, I'm sure even Moses didn't have, nobody has like a beard like a 19th century German materialist. I mean, like those are the like Ingalls especially. Like Ingalls is like a schnauzer who is like turned into a person by a witch or something. Like that's what his beard looks like. But yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, Žižek's description here is exactly right. Because the question is, okay, well, like, yeah, you can have some academic who's like, when they're giving you their like theoretical influences or whatever, they might like name check Marxism, but they're certainly not interested in, or really even pretending to be interested in, any sort of material analysis of anything, really. I mean, like that's, and they're certainly, they're certainly not interested in pursuing class politics as a way of addressing any of it. So it's like, I mean, at that point, it's like, yeah, maybe they're Marxists in the sense that Jordan Peterson is a Nietzschean, that Marx is somebody that they read and kind of vibed with.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, I think that's pretty apt. Yeah, I agree with that. That's great.
Politely saying you are an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about. It's simply, I would like to know, because you, and I like this often, when you attack somebody, you say it aggressively, and what should? Read more, tell me, whom. So I'm asking you now, not read more, I don't advise you, but who are? Give me some names and so on, and who are these postmodern, egalitarian, neo-Marxist, and where do you see any kind even of Marxism? I see in it mostly an impotent, an utterly impotent moralization. Please, I'm so sorry that I was
no, that's no
long,
problem.
please.
Well, I mean, organizations like Jonathan Haidt's, what's it called? Heterodox Academy, and other organizations like that have documented an absolute dearth of conservative voices in the social sciences and the humanities, and about 25%, according to the what I think are reliable surveys, approximately 25% of social scientists in the US identify themselves as Marxists. And so there's that.
But where are the results?
Okay, but
can you name me one? I know a couple of Marxists. For example, who does very solid economic work. Yeah. I don't totally. David Harvey, one, but he writes very serious books of economic analysis and so on and so on. Then there is the old guy who is far from simplification, Frederick Jameson, and so on. But they are totally marginalized today in this politically correct mainstream. I don't see.
Well, yeah, your questions seem to me to focus more on the peculiar relationship that I've noticed and that people have disputed between postmodernism.
Did I ever tell you a joke a friend of mine said? It's just a quote in the comments reminded me of it, where somebody told me once, if you want to know where all the Marxists are in the academy, they're not in the social sciences and they're not in the humanities. They're almost all in the business schools, because if you're in an economics department, you're told Adam Smith is right. If you go into a business school, you're told Marx is right, but you're going to be a capitalist, so make sure you're on the winning side. So just a funny little observation.
Yeah, right. I mean, it kind of reminds me of Richard Wolff's thing about how, like, generally speaking, universities will have one history department and one literature department and one philosophy department, but they all have two economics departments. The one called economics, where you learn to glorify capitalism, and the one called business, where you actually learn useful information about how it works.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
See the connection between the
postmodernist types and the Marxists as a sleight of hand that replaced the notion of the oppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie as the oppression by one identity group by another.
Totally agree with you.
Okay, so so now look, we could.
But that's precisely a non-Marxist gesture par excellence.
Well, that's the I guess that's where we might have a dispute, because I think what happened, especially in France in the 1960s, is as the radical Marxist postmodern types like Derrida and Foucault realized that they were losing the moral battle, especially after the information came out of the Soviet Union in the manner that it came out.
That Solzhenitsyn and so
yeah,
I really want, like, I understand why Slavoj Žižek did not do this in this debate, but like, I really want somebody to interrogate Jordan Peterson about which bits and pieces of history he's like getting mixed up and mangled here. Because, like, what information about the Soviet Union came out after 1968? What is he talking about? Like, that's,
he usually says it's the publication of the Gulag Archipelago, right? That single book just apparently opened everyone's eyes to the evils of the Soviet system and started the transition, right?
Gosh, so yeah, sorry, you were saying, Russell.
I was just going to say it's news to me that Foucault and Derrida are these huge Marxists.
Yeah, I mean, they're not, right? I mean, I've like, he's being a little bit vaguer here, but there's another video I've seen by Peterson where he actually says that like the postmodernists were people who were student revolutionaries in 1968, and then information came out about the Soviet Union. It's like, well, no, Foucault and Derrida were both like professors well before 1968. They both published postmodern books before 1968, and actual Marxists in France hated them. Like, that's the like Sartre, said Foucault was the last barricade in defense of the bourgeoisie. And also, the idea that the Gulag Archipelago was like, oh, how people found out that like Stalinism was really bad. Like Khrushchev's secret speech, right, which then famously became not at all secret, became like massive global news, was 1956. The 1-2 punch of Khrushchev's speech to the 20th Party Congress, and then like the Soviet invasion of Hungary, which convinced a lot of people who were pretty demoralized by the speech that like, oh, actually this wasn't going to be any different. It's just the same old crap. That decimated the membership of most communist parties in the world 12 years before, the May 68, student and worker uprising in Paris. Anybody who was a Marxist who was involved in that, which, by the way, the Soviet-aligned Communist Party of France was not. Like, they were against it. But whatever. Anybody who was a Marxist who was involved in May 68 was probably an anti-Stalinist anyway, and had come, and regardless of whether they were or they weren't, like whatever they thought about revelations of the horrors of Stalinism, they had sorted all that out long beforehand. So it's a really, like, I want to know, I want to ask so many follow-up questions about like his understanding of the timeline here, because like even apart from the philosophical content, every time I hear him talk about this, it drives me crazy.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Go ahead. Oh, okay. Well, I just want to say one of the ironies is that I actually see both Derrida and Foucault as being far more inspired by a number of German luminaries who are far more to Peterson's taste than they probably would be to Marx. I mean, Foucault was very overt in the 1970s, where in an interview he called himself a Nietzschean.
Nietzsche, right? Yeah.
And Derrida, certainly was inspired by Marx. And in the 1990s, he wrote an interesting book called Spectres of Marx, where he talks about how his work was inspired by the kind of critical spirit of Marxism. But certainly most of the books that he was famous for were inspired by different sources than Marxism. A response to French structuralism, very important, by Husserl. Husserl, hugely important. He wrote extensively on Husserlian phenomenology, and of course Heidegger, right? Who Peterson himself consistently cites as a positive figure in his own development.
No,
the whole idea of deconstruction comes from Heidegger.
Yeah, that is a fantastic point. That Nietzsche and Heidegger are way more important to these people as influences than Marx is, and there are also massive influences on Peterson. That it would be actually much more accurate to say that they're postmodern Nietzschean Heideggerians than postmodern Marxists, but that would be really uncomfortable for him.
Well, and
and a lot of us get angry at that. Jameson wrote scathingly about it.
You wouldn't even have to look any further than the Derrida book that Matt mentioned, Spectres of Marx, to see that okay, it is an interesting book, but in no traditional sense is it Marxist. I would say it's far more of a Nietzschean, Heideggerian take. Like I think Matt's point about the spirit of Marxism, maybe, but
yeah, I
you
mean,
be kidding me.
Literally, what Derrida says in that book is that I mean, he says many nice things about Marx, which is what Peterson's latching onto. But like when it comes to which of Marx's ideas he actually agrees with, basically none of them. I mean, like all Derrida says that he's keeping from Marx is like a sort of, with this new international or whatever, is just like a vague critical spirit, like that has essentially nothing to do with any sort of analysis of history, any sort of philosophical theses about materialism, certainly not any kind of Marxist political program.
No, and this is because in large part because Derrida's project, and he gets this partially from a contemporary of his, Emmanuel Levinas, but it's Derrida is part of the ethical turn, which was a sort of displacement. Not sort of, it was a big I'm not saying ethics weren't important, but it displaced politics in theory in the academy for a number of years. And so to associate Derrida, to cite Derrida and Foucault as your main postmodern neo-Marxists is it's laughable.
Yeah, and I should say candidly, a lot of us on the left are pretty tired of actually so much left-wing theorizing being influenced by these postmodern figures. Not because there's anything wrong with Derrida or Foucault, but precisely because we do think it's important to reforeground things like economic analysis, the critique of political economy, and to actually advocate for big structural changes to the contemporary social forum, a la, an argument for democratic socialism. And that's not to crap on Derrida or Foucault. I think there are a lot of interesting things that they say in their book, but you're certainly not going to find a lot of that in there. And I think also that the critique of universalism that they launched, while certainly important for the time, has also kind of run into its limits at this point. And it's not that we want to go away from it back to kind of cheesy imperial universalism, but we certainly need to recognize that there are costs to being anti-universalist as well that have become a lot more transparent recently.
Couldn't agree more.
Underlining how anti-Marxist anti-universalism is. I mean, like this is, since Peterson's whole approach here is this kind of moralistic Cold War hysteria where like, if he catches, Derrida saying something nice about Marx, it's like, he admits it, right? He admits, that he's a commie. But like, whatever. I mean, Derrida, there's so it's so hard to figure out any like actual politics there at all, really. But like certainly Foucault, if any, there's all this stuff about power that read in a certain light, sometimes seems to be about oppression, although sometimes seems to be like sort of resist putting it that way. But like to the extent that it is claims about oppression. Like if you see power everywhere, every relationship, whatever, and like whatever, I mean, then like that really takes the heat off of class society, because it's like, it's like, yeah, if everything is power, then like that's, yeah.
Completely. And I would say also that I think that Foucault is part of this sort of vitalist tradition that has worked and to, unintentionally or unwittingly served to reinforce the sort of rightist dismantling of the state, because you have Foucault. I admire Foucault greatly. I still read Foucault. I teach Foucault. I use him in my work.
100%,
but
yeah.
I do think that there is a real sense in which the suspicion of just the state in general, again, evacuated much of leftist, at least intellectual work, starting from like, the mid to late 60s up through the early 2000s, of any sort of actual political program other than sort of perpetual resistance.
Yeah, and Terry Eagleton had a fantastic book that he released in the 1990s that I cite frequently called The Illusions of Postmodernism. And it's a polemic, so he overstates things considerably. But one of the most important points that he raised that certainly inspired me a lot in my work on postmodern conservatism as he says, look, there's this presupposition that's emerged as a result of the post-structuralist turn that anti-universalism, a fixation on tradition and particularism are all inherently left-wing things. And he says they can be if they're used to agitate against things like neoliberalism, if they're used to agitate against things like liberal imperialism, or later on neoconservative imperialism for that matter. But he says you should never presuppose that the support for particularism and traditionalism is inherently radical or progressive, because these kinds of arguments have been put forward by people like Edmund Burke for a long time, and that's not some place that you want to go, right? And I think that this strange affinity that you can sometimes find between aspects of postmodern arguments and things like Burkeanism, traditionalism, particularism has been under-theorized. But it's really worth looking into, because I think there's a reason why it is that a lot of conservatives today have successfully weaponized elements of particularist arguments to try to agitate for what are fundamentally reactionary traditions. Because there's a lot of complementarity between their outlook and the arguments that some of these figures have put forward, at the very least.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
It is. I mean, it's a provocative thesis, right? And I don't want to push it too far, because I don't want to say like fucking, Derrida was actually a conservative, and just didn't know it or something. But, it's worth contemplating, Eagleton's point.
Fair enough.
The whole bloody Stalinist.
Yeah. The whole Stalinist catastrophe, along with the entire Maoist catastrophe, that they didn't really have a leg to stand on. And instead of revising their notion that human history, and this is a Marxist notion, should be regarded as the eternal class struggle between the economically deprived and the oppressors, they just recast it and said, well, it's not based on economics, it's based on identity, but it's still fundamentally oppressor against oppressed. And to me, that meant that they smuggled the fundamental narrative of Marxism and many of its goals back into the argument without ever admitting that they did so. Now, I've been criticized, for this supposition, because people who are postmodernists say, look, one of the hallmarks of postmodernism is skepticism of meta-narratives. It's like, I know that perfectly well. And I also know that Marxism is a meta-narrative, and so you shouldn't be able to be a postmodernist and a Marxist. But I still see the union of those two things in the insistence that the appropriate way to look at the world is to view it as the battleground between groups defined by a particular between individuals defined by a particular group identity, so that the group identity becomes paramount, and then the proper reading is always oppressor versus oppressed, with a secondary insistence that's very similar to Marx's insistence upon the moral superiority of the proletariat, that the oppressors are by definition, because they're oppressed, morally superior. And there's the call for perhaps not revolutionary change, although that comes up above, but change in the structure so that that oppression disappears, so that a certain form of equality comes about. Now, you argued that Marx wasn't a believer in equality of outcome, and I'm not so sure about that, because his notion of the eventual utopia that would constitute genuine communism was a place where all class divisions were eradicated.
But
and so there's
hierarchies.
Well, there's at least an implication that the most important of the hierarchies had disappeared. And so maybe he had enough sophistication to talk about other forms of hierarchies.
The answer is definitely
if that's the case, then I can't imagine why he thought that the utopia that would emerge as a consequence of the elimination of economic hierarchies would be a utopia. Because if there were other forms of hierarchies that still existed, people would be just as contentious about them as they are now. Like we have hierarchies of attractiveness, for example, that have nothing to do with economics, or very little to do with economics. And there's no shortage of contention around that or any other form of ability. And so that's why I associate the social justice types who are basically postmodernist with Marx. They're postmodernist with Marxism. It's the insistence that you view the world through the narrative of oppressed versus oppressor. And I think it's a catastrophe. And you appear to think that it's a catastrophe as well.
Just one sentence, and then you can reply. It's so strange that you mention, for example, somebody like Foucault, who, for me, are you aware that his main target was Marxism? Okay, for him represented in his game was never a radical change, and this is what I don't like in this, what you call postmodern, let's not call them Marxists, but revolutionaries. It's this enjoying your own self-marginalization. The good thing is to be on the margin, like not in the center and so on and so on. It almost made me nostalgic for old communists who at least had the honesty to say, no, we don't enjoy our marginal position. We want to do something central power. I find so disgusting.
It's no wonder you don't get invited to lots of places.
Yeah. No, Foucault for me embodies this logic of revolution, and by revolution he meant any social change, serious, that small resistances and so on, small marginal places of resistance and so on and so on. So, okay, but let's maybe drop it here if you want. But since you are replying my question, you should have the last word here.
No, I'll stop with that. Let's move to the next. We'll get back to these topics, no doubt, as we move forward with the question. So I'm happy to let that particular issue stop.
Did you already do your Stalinist manipulation and censored the questions and how? Because this program that he described to us through some screens, questions, and so on, I think it puts him to the one who decides which questions are, as Stalinists would have put in, are the real voice of the people.
I love how uncomfortable this guy is being called
Yeah.
Stalinist or Stalin even being invoked.
Yeah. Well, it's also a very Canadian thing. Let me just tell you. We're not quite British in our antipathy to physical contact, but it's pretty close, right? My wife is Mexican, and actually, she chatted me the other day. She's like, "Why don't you hold my hand when I'm on the street?" I'm like, "Does you see anybody holding hands here? That's not what we do. We're cold, aloof people, you know." And she's like, "Well, that's going to change." I'm like, yeah, "Fair enough."
Yeah, fair enough. It is. I mean, we've talked about this, so we didn't do a big thing here, but it is just absolutely outrageous and absurd. This like thing that he keeps saying about Marx believing in the moral superiority of workers. Yeah. Like it's just great. It's like it's fingernails on a chalkboard. Like every time he says that, because like you could not possibly miss the point more than that.
I mean, aside from the 1865 groundwork for the metaphysics of proletarian morals. I mean, that's
sure.
Peterson did on. Yeah, let's leave that out of it, though.
It's exactly like the one thing that Marx is not writing about is individual morality, like really at all. He has and the whole like the entire. It's really hard to fit like. Words don't do justice to how big a mistake you're making if you think that's the point. Like the whole point of Marxism is that you're engaged in structural analysis of systems and economic forces, and like it doesn't mean that there's no normative preferences, right? But that are maybe motivating the whole project, but they're not about like individual behavior. That's just nuts.
No, I mean, the closest he would come, I think, would be to denounce bourgeois moralism or bourgeois morality, by which he essentially means ideology, right?
Right.
Yeah, no. I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead, Ben.
No, go for it.
No, I just wanted to say there's an interesting historical point to make here. That's not really germane to politics, but I'm still going to make it because I find it a fascinating point. Which is that the two major disciples of Hegelian dialectics who broke very strongly with Hegel's kind of orthodox view, but nonetheless carried on the tradition in a certain interesting way, were Marx on the one hand and Kierkegaard on the other. And I'm not the first person to point this out, right? But what's interesting about it is precisely what Ben said. On the one hand, you have Marx's appropriation of Hegel, where the world is understood in very primary colors, big structures, huge movements, the titanic transition from one historical epoch as determined by material relations to the next. And on the other hand, you have Kierkegaard, who was a rather conservative guy in a strange sense, but nonetheless is, the philosopher of interiority, the philosophy of the subject, this idea that meaning has to come from within you. And I think it really just is a testament to the richness of Hegel's thought, opaque though it is, that two people would read him and come away with such different reactions, critical reactions, I should say, right? But I have to think that one of the reasons why these debates fall into a mire so frequently is people like Žižek are very overtly speaking from a Marxist standpoint, talking about structural change, and aren't really that concerned with the morality of individual capitalists per se, right? Whereas somebody like Peterson, coming from a much more Kierkegaardian existential direction, just can't help but see a Marxist argument in moralistic terms, right?
Right, exactly.
Coming from this standpoint, it's always about, well, they must be blaming these people or saying they're bad in some way, shape, or form, because that's just what it means to criticize something. And nothing could be further from, I think, the spirit of a genuine analytical Marxism.
Yeah, which is also, of course, I mean, I guess to be fair, what you're, I think, correctly accusing Peterson there of is something that I see a certain kind of lefty doing a lot of too.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. We're guilty of it as well.
Which is that, like, they'll say, like I don't know, like if you criticize like left-wing moralism and say it's unhelpful and counterproductive and we shouldn't act like this, they will interpret it as a individual moral judgment on people who are engaged in moralism, like just because they cannot break out of taking everything everybody says as an individual moral judgment, so they don't even know how else they could possibly interpret a critique of moralism except as like a moralistic one. So they'll say like they'll start doing all these things like, oh, you say canceling is bad, but what about and they'll come up, can I cancel, if Jeffrey Dahmer were alive and on Twitter, can I cancel him? And they're looking for exceptions or some sort of I don't know, priestly or rabbinical.
I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer would probably run a cooking show, wouldn't he?
Yeah. He'd mostly just post on Twitter promos for his cooking show, but he and they'll say and what they're looking for is some sort of permission, right, to do canceling behavior. It's like, guys, you just could not be missing the point more fundamentally. I'm saying that we should be thinking less in terms of individual morality, and you're taking this as a claim about individual morality that if you cancel, you're a bad person and you should be canceled. It's like, and yeah, as you said, Peterson is totally doing the same thing here. He's so fixated on moral finger wagging about individual behavior that when he hears people who have a completely different worldview, he's like, okay, so you must be saying that you're morally finger wagging individual capitalists and morally celebrating individual workers. Is that the point? Am I getting it? It's like that. It's like that scene in The Simpsons. Coffee, beer, coffee.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is transparently clear in a lot of Marx's writings, where he actually has very little to say about the morality of individual capitalists, and in fact stresses several times that one of the interesting things about capitalists is they don't even think very much about their workers, which is part of the problem. They think neither of exploiting them or of improving their situations, because the primary thing capitalists are concerned about, at least in volume 1, is other capitalists, right? Since they're the ones that they're competing with. But you do occasionally get this kind of purple prose, since Marx was a journalist, where he'll describe capital as a vampire, sucking the blood of living labor, which is quite evocative, right? But I don't think there's anything necessarily in Marxism that precludes you from acknowledging that there can be very good people who are capitalists and very bad people who are proletarians, right? In fact, we all can think of plenty of examples. But that says nothing about whether or not the system as a whole needs to be reformed or overthrown. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll bet, I'm pretty sure that Karl Marx thought that Friedrich Engels was a good guy.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
And in fact, I mean, then that's not inconsistent. I mean, in the only Marxist book that Jordan Peterson has ever read, he says right at the beginning that there's a section of there are individual members of the capitalist class who will come over, and join the revolution. I mean, that's explicitly in the text.
Yeah, I mean, he says the proletariat is recruited from all levels of society.
Yeah, which was he is recruited.
Even if you want to view these identity, even if you want to view it through the lens of a sort of identitarianism, it's not a fixed it's not a fixed identity, right? I mean, the proletariat is made up of bourgeoisie that has not entirely, but has fallen right into the proletariat. So
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and this is the same thing on a different level of analysis. Like, I mean, this is part of what, like, Peterson is like so convinced that all of leftism is identity politics. It's like, okay, so you must be an economic identity. It's like, no, you don't. Like, you're talking about objective class position, which has absolutely nothing to do. Like, identity is about how you see yourselves or about how others see you, right? You and your boss could both be dewy-eyed libertarians who sincerely believe that there's no such thing as class, and you're all just market actors meeting each other on an equal playing field, and there's he's the owner and you're associates, and it would still be true that you're a worker and he's a boss. We shouldn't respect, which is really like shows you the difference between identity categories and economic ones, right? If somebody has a gender identity that differs from their sex at birth, and you're not an asshole, you respect that. If somebody has an economic identity that differs from material reality, you shouldn't respect it. You should try to convince them that they actually are a worker and they should organize, for as such.
I mean, this is why I entirely agree with Walter Ben Michael's argument that class is not an identificatory category in the way that race, sex, gender, other identity categories are. It's not. It doesn't work according to the same logic. I mean, Adolf Reed will make arguments to much the same effect, but yeah, I just think that, Ben, you're saying that, when Peterson is sort of, he can't, or maybe it was Matt, I'm forgetting now, but he can't help but view a leftist perspective as though it's sort of, a priori identitarian, when clearly Marxism does not operate that way.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, I also want to say that that's actually essential to Marx's whole theoretical apparatus, right? Since he talks a great deal about a class in itself and a class for itself. And one of the things that's really interesting about this kind of dialectical analysis is he says, look, one of the reasons why we don't have a revolution right now is there are many people who might actually be working class, including adjunct professors, but they don't actually conceive of themselves in this way, which is one of the reasons why the exploitative system persists. And the way that we'll get to revolutionary activity is when we actually acknowledge that most people are in the working classes, and everyone comes to that level of self-consciousness, which is when the possibility for genuine revolutionary change becomes available, right? And I think it's actually quite a sophisticated take, and it relates back to his account of ideology, right? That many people, in fact, contra the kind of woke mantra, don't want to see themselves as exploited or working class, which is part of the problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Walter Ben Michaels and Adolf Reed are basically right about everything. But I also want to just shout out here a book that the Peterson's thing about hierarchy at the end of the part that we just watched reminded me of, which is Four Futures by Peter Fraze, who is actually somebody I often disagree with about intra-left stuff, but he says some really insightful things in this book, Four Futures. He has, and I think on this question of hierarchy, I think he puts it really well here, right? He says, for it's surely not the case that all hierarchies and conflicts, even now, can be reduced to the logic of capital. At the same time, so long as most people are dependent on wage labor, it's also impossible to completely separate any given conflict from that fundamental one. Rather than thinking of the capital relation as the root from which all oppression and conflict grows, perhaps a better metaphor would be that the conflict between capital and labor shapes all of their social relations the way a magnetic field influences the object around it. So skipping down, he says the capital relation is a kind of social magnet with capital on one end and labor at the other that tends to align all these social hierarchies with a master hierarchy based on money. Hence, the hierarchy of athletic ability is translated into a hierarchy of payment for performing professionally. And he goes on from there. And his point is that in what he'd call, like in the book, he has this kind of schema about thinking about future societies where you can have either abundance or scarcity and either hierarchy or more egalitarian societies. And of course, that's a simplified scheme, as I think he himself would acknowledge. And Matt pointed out some of the problems with like abundance as a conceptual category earlier. But in so out of the four possible futures, the communist one, which is abundance plus relatively non-hierarchical economic arrangements. He says, look, of course, all these other hierarchies, would exist, like all these other things you could call hierarchies, hierarchies of athletic ability, hierarchies of beauty, hierarchies of this, hierarchy of that, but they wouldn't all be organized around the central hierarchy of money, and that would be massive civilizational progress. Because that, that way. I mean, for one thing, there's you have a way better chance if you have a bunch of distinct, places that you could shine, without material resources systematically, limiting your life possibilities. He also quotes in there one of my favorite. We were talking about Corey Robin earlier. I always love the thing where Corey adopts Freud's thing about the purpose of psychoanalysis and applies it to politics. Where he says that the point of socialism isn't to bring about utopia; it's to convert hysterical misery into ordinary unhappiness.
That's a good quote.
Yeah, totally agree. You have to send me that, Ben. What we just showed, that was great. That was a perfect analogy, I thought.
All right.
Let's move on from that.
At heart this evening, we're talking about happiness. At least that's the frame of the debate that we have tonight. And you've both been in your work and also tonight very critical of happiness as mere hedonism, pleasure-seeking, or even simply as a feeling. What does true or deeper human happiness consist of, and how is it attained?
I don't care.
Well, I don't. First of all, there's something you said 5 minutes ago or so. I think you were still at the podium that I agree with profoundly, which is that happiness is a side effect. It's not a thing in itself. It's something that comes upon you. It's like an act of grace in some sense. And my sense is that
even the theological undertone of what you said. No, the category of grace can be used in a perfect atheist sense. It's one of the deepest categories.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, good. Well, I would think that we can find agreement about that partly because of your psychoanalytic background. You know perfectly well that we're subject to forces within us that aren't of our voluntary control. And certainly happiness is one of those, because you cannot will yourself to be happy. You might be able to will yourself to be unhappy, but you can't will yourself to be happy. There are certain preconditions that have to be met that are quite mysterious in order for you to be happy. And then it happens. And then maybe if you're wise, you regard that as a minor incomprehensible miracle that somehow you happen to be in the right place at the right time. Now, I've made the case that the most effective means of pursuing the good life, which is not the same as pursuing happiness, is to adopt something like a stance of maximal responsibility towards the suffering and malevolence in the world. And I think that should be pursued primarily as an individual responsibility. It's not like I don't think that political and familial larger organizations are necessary, but in the final analysis, we each suffer alone in some fundamental sense. And we have our own malevolence to contend with in some fundamental sense. And the proper beginning of moral behavior, which is the proper beginning of the right way to act in the world, is to take responsibility for that. I think you do what you can to conceptualize the highest good that you can conceptualize. That's the first thing, to develop a vision of what might be. And it has to be a personalized vision as well as a universalized vision. And then you work diligently to ensure that your actions are in keeping with that. And you allow yourself on that pursuit to be informed by the knowledge of your ignorance and the necessity for acting and speaking in truth. And a fair bit of that, I believe, is derived. I think it's fair to say that that's derived from an underlying Judeo-Christian ethic. And I make no bones about the fact that I think of those stories metaphysically or philosophically or psychologically, as fundamental to the proper functioning of our society insofar as it can function properly. And so it's not happiness, it's meaning. And meaning is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. And then I'll close with this. Responsibility is not only to do what you believe to be right. That's not, because that's duty. That's not enough. Yeah. That's sort of what the conservatives put forward as the ultimate virtue, which is duty. It's not that. It's that you're acting in a manner that is in accordance with what you believe to be right, but you're doing it in a manner that simultaneously expands your ability to do it, which means that you cannot stay safely ensconced within the confines of your current ethical beliefs. You have to stand on the edge of what you know and encounter continually the consequences of your ignorance to expand your domain of knowledge and ability so that you're not only acting in an efficient manner, but you're increasing the efficiency and productivity and meaningfulness of what it is that you're engaged in. And I think that, and I believe that the psychological evidence supports this, even the neuropsychological evidence, is that that's when true happiness descends upon you, because it's an indication from the deepest recesses of your psyche, biologically instantiated, that you're in the right place at the right time. You're doing what you should be doing, but you're doing it in a manner that expands your capacity to do even better things in the future. And I think that's the deepest human instinct there is. It's not rational. It's far deeper than that. And it's something that's genuine and that exists within us and that constitutes a proper guide if you don't pervert it with self-deception and deceit. So that's my perspective.
Yeah, okay. I'll try, if you are stupid enough to believe me, to be brief. You know? First, I like very much what you began with, this grace, or whatever we call it, moment of happiness. And I would like to, would you agree that the same goes for love, I think? We have in English, and they have it in French. I don't know if in other languages they have it. They use the verb to fall in love, which means it's in this sense, in some sense, a fall. You are surprised, you are shocked. Authentic love, I think, is something very traumatic, even in this sense. I always like to use this example. Let's say you live a stupidly happy life. Maybe one night stand here and there, you drink with friends, then you fall in love passionately. This is, in some sense, a catastrophe for your life. All the balance is lost, and so on.
Yes.
You know.
That's why Cupid has arrows.
Sorry? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
It is, yeah.
Second, surprisingly maybe for you, I agree with your point about Judeo-Christian legacy, for which I am very much attacked, Eurocentrist, and so on and so on. You know, I wonder if you would agree with it. I will try to condense it very much. You know what's for me the deepest, I simplify it to the utmost, something unheard of, and I, as an atheist, accept the spiritual value of it, happens in Christianity. In other religions, you have God up there, we fall from God, and then we try to climb back through spiritual discipline, whatever, training, good deeds, and so on and so on. The formula of Christianity is a totally different one. As we philosophers would have put it, you don't climb to God. God, you are free in a Christian sense when you discover that the distance that separates you from God is inscribed into God himself. That's why I agree with those intelligent theologists, like my favorite, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, who said that the cross, the crucifixion, is something absolutely unique, because in that moment of Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, God, Father, why have you abandoned me? For a brief moment, symbolically, God himself becomes an atheist, in the sense of, you get a gap there. And that is something so absolutely unique. It means that you are not simply separated from God. Your separation from God is part of divinity itself. And we can then put it also in other terms, maybe closer to you, like that. That's why for me, happiness is not some blissful unity with highest value. It's the very struggle, the fall, and so on. And that's why I hope we both worry about what will this possibility of so-called, I'm horrified with it, what Ray Kurzweil calls singularity and this blissful state. I prefer not to know, but the final point, very brief. What I only don't quite get, why do you put so much access to this? We have to begin with a personal change. I mean, this is also the second
probably number 2 highlight.
Forgive me, of your slogans in your book. You know, first set your house in order, then. But I have an extremely common sense, naive question here. But what if in trying to set your house in order, you discover that your house is in disorder precisely because the way the society is messed up, which doesn't mean, okay, let's forget about my house. But you can do both at the same time. And I would even say, I will give you now the ultimate example, yourself. Isn't it that you are so socially active? Because you realize that it's not enough to tell to your patients, set your house in order. Much of the reason of why they are in disorder, their house, is that there is some crisis in our society and so on and so on. So my reproach to you, benevolent, would have been, you know, the joke, tea or coffee, yes, please. Like individual or social, yes, please, because this is obvious in extreme situation. Like, I hope we agree to say to somebody in North Korea, set your house in order. No, I mean, but I think in some deeper sense, it goes also for our societies. I'm just repeating what you are telling. You see some kind of a social crisis, and I don't see clearly why insist so much on this choice. Because, sorry, just to finish, I will give you an example that I think perfectly does it. How do we usually deal with ecology? By this false personalization. You know, they tell you, what did you do? Did you put all the Coke cans on the side? Did you recycle all paper? And so, yes, we should do this. But, you know, like, in a way, this is also a very easy way to discharge yourself. Like, you say, okay, I do the recycling, so up, you know, I did my thing, let's go on. So just say, I choice there.
Okay, so, well, first of all, I have to point out that you have unfairly tasked me with 3 very difficult questions, and so I'm hoping that I can.
That's life. That's life.
I just wanted to pause here very briefly. Because actually, this is one of the most innovative things I find about Žižek's work, and I'm writing about it in my new book, The Emergence of Postmodernity. So there's a plug for that coming out in a few months for those of you who are interested. But this kind of dialectical materialist interpretation of the history of Christianity and Christian thought, I think, is extremely innovative. And to a certain extent, people have accused Žižek of using it almost as a gag or a trope to kind of entice controversy, right? I mean, I remember he once described himself as a classical Christian Marxist, right? And people were like, oh, what is that? But this reading he has of the Christian tradition as, in some respects, fundamentally anti-Aristotelian in the sense of arguing for a universe that's entirely open-ended and ultimately defined by human freedom, which in turn explains why it is that alienation is such a permanent feature of human life, I think is, generally speaking, not only innovative, but broadly speaking, right. And I think it's a real testament to the fact that he's engaged in this kind of innovative work, that so many people have struggled to really think through the kind of dynamic that he's talking about. And that really shows you that you're onto something, to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, if anyone watching or listening is interested, especially the point about God himself in Christianity, the Christian God being divided, that it's God's distance from himself is what's reinforced there. He did a book with John Milbank, one of the radical Orthodoxians, titled "The Monstrosity of Christ." But also, if people are interested, he illustrates this point through his discussion of Martin Scorsese's film, The Last Temptation of Christ.
Oh, that's a great film.
In The Pervert's Guide to Ideology. And it's pretty, I think he said afterwards that he didn't really want to do that part because he's not a big Scorsese fan. Actually, he said this was a state secret, but he said it on camera so everyone knows it. But he was like, Sophie finds the director like that point that he makes about Christianity and God divided from himself. She wanted to make sure to get that in there, and so I guess he humored her and shot that. But it's well done if people are interested in watching it.
Absolutely. And I mean, just to the more political point, it's something that I mentioned the last time we had this discussion where I talked about Peterson's work, which is that fundamentally, from a Žižekian perspective, a lot of so-called Christian conservatives aren't really Christian. They're Aristotelians of one flavor or another who believe that God created this wonderful ordered universe and a divine nature, and we are not to fuck with it, basically. And one of the things that Hegel points out in his lectures on religion is that's actually really wrong. If you read, for instance, the book of Genesis, when we're cast out of Eden, it's not because God said they fucked up and unified nature. So there you go. He says it's because you've now picked of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. And so you're now like me in knowing good and evil. And so you have to participate in creation in the same way that I would, which is a very, very different philosophy than what you see espoused by Aristotle, for example. And I think it's really telling that people like Peterson just can't wean themselves off of this kind of stratified naturalistic iteration of Christianity because it accords a lot more with this need to have a kind of hierarchical universe and to see any kind of break from that hierarchy as in some sense a signifier of decadence and decline inexorably.
Yeah,
rather than, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I mean, it is really funny. I mean, the more you think about this, like I mean, I understand, obviously, for a huge part of the history of the church, like that kind of Aristotelianism, is such a massive influence on the Christian intellectual tradition, that it makes sense that it's all over the place still now. But it's also like really weird, like just sort of taken literally, because it's like, come on, guys. I mean, like this could not be further from that in some ways. I mean, this is literally a religious tradition that says that. That God is made flesh and suffers, and, I mean that could not be less of that sort of, and that in identification with this suffering incarnate God, all distinctions between, Jew and Greek and man and woman and slave and free are sort of dissolved away in that, like that's such a weird fit with that kind of like neat and tidy, Aristotelian ordered hierarchical universe where everything is balanced and everything is exactly the way it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really hoping that there's a lot more work done on this. I'm trying to do my own small part, but because I think it's a really interesting kind of way trying to build bridges with a conservative Christian community that would likely be very hostile to things like radical theory through exploring the kind of latent radicalness within their own tradition, right? And I think he's very good at that.
Yeah.
I also think some of what you're talking about, I mean, it might be, yeah. I mean, I like in a lot of ways, I'm a pretty, I'm actually like a pretty old-fashioned, square, kind of, old-fashioned atheist. But I also think that, in terms of like, views that people could have or work that people could do. I mean, some of what you're describing, like I think.
Did you once say that Martin Scorsese was God, Ben? I'm sure that I heard you say that.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, this is how far I am
Scorsesean
on both topics, right? I think there is no God and Martin Scorsese is his prophet, but in any case, I don't know. Or Coppola. Basically, I just like all the Italians, but in any case, I think. Yeah, actually, I'm a giant Scorsese fan, but I think that like a lot of Jewish mysticism is about God is divided, God in exile is being exiled from himself, and things like that. So I think there's probably something interesting to be written about that, in connection with what you're talking about. All right, let's get a little bit more in. I think we just decided behind the scenes this is going to be a quadrilogy because we've got about half an hour left of the debate, and given how much time is taken with the talking about it for this one, it's we're probably not going to get through that, but let's get through at least a little bit more.
So I'm hoping that I have the mental wherewithal to keep them in track and answer them in order, but you can help me if I stray. I was very interested in your comments about Christ's atheism on the cross, that final moment of atheism. That's something I'd never thought about in that way.
Chesterton orthodoxy. A short book, excellent.
No, it's a very interesting thought, because it's an unbelievably merciful idea in some sense, that the burden of life is so unbearable. And you see in the Christian passion, of course, torture, unfair judgment by society, betrayal by friends, and then a low death. And so that's about as bad as it gets, right? Which is why it's an archetypal story, right? It's about as bad as it gets. And the story that you describe points out that it's so bad that even God himself might despair about the essential quality of being.
Yeah.
Right. So that is merciful in some sense, because it does say that there is something that's built into the fabric of existence that tests us so severely in our faith about being itself that even God himself falls prey to the temptation to doubt. And so that's okay. Now, this is where things get very complicated, because I want to use that in part to answer the other questions that you answered. Look, there's a very large clinical literature that suggests that if you want to develop optimal resilience, what you do is you lay out a pathway towards somewhere better. Someone comes in, they have a problem. You try to figure out what the problem is, and then you try to figure out what might constitute a solution. And so you have something approximating a map, right? And it's a tentative map of how to get from where things aren't so good to where they're better. And then you have the person go out in the world and confront those things that they're avoiding, that are stopping them from moving towards that higher place. And there's an archetypal reality to that. It's you're in a fallen state, you're attempting to redeem yourself, the process by which that has to occur. And that process involves voluntary confrontation with what you're afraid of, disgusted by, and inclined to avoid. And that works. Every psychological school agrees upon that, is that exposure therapy, the psychoanalysts expose you to the tragedies of your past, and redeem you in that manner. And the behaviorists expose you to the terrors of the present and redeem you in that manner. But there's a broad agreement across psychological schools that works. And my sense is that we're called upon as individuals precisely to do that in our life, is that we are faced by this unbearable reality that you made reference to when you talked about the situation on the cross, is that life itself is fundamentally, and this is a pessimism that we might share, is fundamentally suffering and malevolence. But, and this is I think where we differ, I believe that the evidence suggests that the light that you discover in your life is proportionate to the amount of the darkness that you're willing to forthrightly confront, and that there's no necessary upper limit to that. So I think that the good that people are capable of is actually, it's a higher good than the evil that people are capable of. And believe me, I do not say that lightly, given what I know about the evil that people are capable of. And I believe that the central psychological message of the biblical corpus fundamentally is that's why it culminates in some sense with the idea that it's necessary to adopt it's necessary to confront the devil and to accept your, what would you say, the unjustness of your tortured mortality. If you can do that, it's a challenge, as you just pointed out, that's sufficient to challenge even God himself, that you have the best chance of transcending it and living the kind of life that will set your house in order and everyone's house in order at the same time. And so I think that's even true in states like North Korea. And I'm not asking people to foolishly immolate themselves for pointless reasons. When I'm working with people who are clinically and they have a terrible oppressor who's their boss at work, I don't suggest that they march in and tell them exactly what they think of them and end up on the street. It's not helpful, And so the pathway towards adopting individual responsibility happens to be a very individual one. But I do believe that the best bet for most people is to solve the problems that beset them in their own lives, the ethical problems that beset them, that they know are problems, and that they can set themselves together well enough so that they can then become capable of addressing larger scale problems without falling prey to some of the errors that characterize, let's say, over-optimistic and intellectually arrogant ideologues. I'll close. Well,
but very briefly.
Let me close with one thing. One of my favorite quotes from Carl Jung, it's actually a quote that I used at the beginning of my first book, which was called Maps of Meaning, was that if you take a personal problem seriously enough, you will simultaneously solve a social problem. And this bears on your point, because it's not like your small family, even the relationship between you and your wife, is immune in some sense to the broader social problems around you. And so let's say right now there's tremendous tension between men and women in the West, and that's certainly the case given the divorce rate. Let's say that would be some evidence. And the later and later ages that people are waiting to become enter into permanent relationships. There's a real tension there. And then if you do establish a relationship with a woman or a partner, but we'll say a woman in this particular case, you are instantly faced with all of the sociological problems in a microcosm in that relationship. And then if you work those damn problems out, if you can work them out within your relationship, then you can get some insight. It's not complete insight, but you can get some partial insight into what the problem actually is and get the diagnosis right. And you've moved some small measure forward in addressing what might constitute the broader social concern. And what's even better, you're punished for your own goddamn mistakes. And that's another thing I like about the idea of working locally, is that, if I do broad scale social experiments and they fail, it's like, well, tough luck for the people for whom they failed. But if I'm experimenting on myself within the confines of my own relationship and I make a mistake, I'm going to feel the pain. And that's good, that's just, but it also gives me the possibility of learning. And so I believe that you do solve what you can about yourself first before you can set your family straight and before you should dare to try to set the world straight. Otherwise, you degenerate into this kind of, you already talked about it, this shallow moralizing, well, I've divided my goddamn Coke cans up, and now I can spend more money on new packaging at the supermarket, which is exactly what the psychological research indicates that people do if they perform a casual moral action. They immediately justify committing a less moral action because they've put themselves in a higher moral place. And you might, if you were a real pessimist, you'd say, well, that's why they performed the action to begin with. I think that's often true. That's associated with that shallow moralizing.
I will say there's a very powerful story recounted in the Brothers Karamazov that apparently actually happened that Peterson often refers to justify this account of life as suffering. So for listeners who don't know, the Brothers Karamazov, written by Fyodor Dostoevsky, it's one of the last things that he wrote, certainly the last big book. But the story runs, it's about a serf family who ended up imprisoning their child out in basically a shed for the night during the middle of winter. And despite the fact that the kid was saying, you got to let me out, I'm going to die, the parents just let the kid freeze to death, right? And the kind of Dostoevskian interest in this is, of course, how could somebody do something like this, right? It's just so awful. It seems to exceed the limitations of the human mind to comprehend. And I think it really is worth inquiring into problems like that, as Peterson points out. And naturally, there's a large literature going back to, really, say, St. Augustine on the problem of evil. And it's worth taking very seriously, both at the individual level and at the social level. Where I don't follow him, and I'm sure that we're all going to jump on this in a few seconds, is that claim that the most important way to solve the problem of evil is, to take care of your own life before you change the world. Because as we've all said here many a time, first off, a lot of times the problems in your life and the kind of resentments that might generate from that are fundamentally related to social conditions. And I think the other thing that I really like to stress is if you need to find some project that gives your life a sense of meaning that goes beyond yourself, I can think of one that's much better than trying to make the world into a better place for other people, right? And there are just countless examples of this. Not to mention, I also think it's impossible, since nobody is going to have their life put so well together that they can then just sit there and be like, well, my marriage is going 100%, my kids are fine, I paid my mortgage off, so now I'm going to run that NGO that I've always wanted to. That's just not the way that life works. And if we keep waiting for people to hit that point before we try to make improvements in the world, then we're going to be waiting a long fucking time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Slavoj North Korea thing was just the perfect counterpoint, because, even apply that back to what Peterson was saying in that last part that we just watched. Okay, so do North Koreans only get to do small scale local projects where they'll feel the pain of their experiments with changing the municipal sewage system in Pyongyang, or at some point are they allowed to fight for democracy and civil liberties, North Korea as a whole? All right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think I've mentioned this last time, but we're seeing that right now with the strike for 15 that's going on with a lot of people in the fast food industry. I forgot to mention, as an act of solidarity, not just for McDonald's workers, but also Chipotle workers who I read in Jacobin are going through a hell of a time right now. But I think that what they're doing is a very meaningful activity, not just for themselves, since if they win, that's going to be a big improvement in their lives, but for all the people who come afterwards who are going to have to work in jobs like that, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I don't know. I don't know if fighting for $15 an hour so you can buy, so you can buy groceries and make your rent and your, and you don't run out of insulin is a, I don't know if that counts as a sufficiently small scale thing that you're allowed to do that in Petersonian terms. But if not, that strikes me as a problem for the view, and also just, okay, what about the pain? Yeah, great. So your failed social experiment, a failed social experiment, might cause pain. Sure, no argument for me there. But maintaining a deeply miserable status quo also inflicts tons of pain. I mean, this isn't this isn't a choice between, inflicting pain and everybody will be fine, right? It's a, I mean, it's a choice between continuing something that's causing industrial strength doses of pain all the time, and doing something that, yeah, maybe if it goes horribly wrong, might, cause even more, and that'd be horrible. But would also be something, presumably the motivation for the social experiment is so you could stop that.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of what Žižek talks about in his book Violence, everyday quotidian violence that we don't even recognize as violence because it's so systemic and so interwoven into the fabric of our life that it's less visible than I don't know, riots, right? What we
right.
Violence.
Yeah. Yeah, right. But I mean, not only does it cause just as much suffering, but I mean, lots of it is enforced with violence in the usual sense of the term. Just in ways that are routine. You don't think about, that you have a society where you have people like, you know, Shane Patrick Boyle, you know, the guy who died because the GoFundMe for his you know, month's worth of insulin he was trying to buy, you know, wasn't quite filled. Well, I mean, it's not like the insulin didn't exist in the world. It's just that you can't just take it because, like, there are, you know, armed police who are there to stop that from happening. And so that's a constant, you know, enforcement of violence, which is, you know, whatever. I mean, like, any society is going to have rules and somebody's going to have to enforce them, no doubt about it, right? But I mean, like, the point, you know, I think the sort of deep Žižekian point there is that, like, these are choices between, like, what kind of violence we're willing to accept, or, you know, what kind of violence, you know, we're willing to endorse in exchange for avoiding what other kind of violence. They're not choices between violence and no violence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he made this point very effectively early in the debate, where he says that we need to invert the Dostoevskian formula, right? That the classical Dostoevskian formula is that without God, everything is permitted. But in a true Lacanian fashion, we need to say instead that only a man with a God can think that everything is permitted, right? That he's vindicated and just pursuing divine necessity to the utmost extremes of human action. And I think this is a really Marxist point as well, since Marx was one of the people who consistently pointed out that, look, capitalism produces a tremendous amount of suffering and irrationalities that could be rectified. We have the material resources to do it. But one of the reasons that it's never rectified is because we're attached to the ideology of capitalism, which tends to naturalize these kinds of suffering. And in the same way as priests used to say, look, if you suffer, it's because you've sinned, we now say, if you suffer, that's just what the market requires. Or even worse, that's a result of personal failings on your part because you just didn't work hard enough, right? You didn't labor to the extent that was necessary. And in exposing these kind of positions as ideologies, he's making the point that we shouldn't lean on them as a justification for allowing suffering that can be relieved when it's in our power to relieve it.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, and of course, look, none of this is to say that you know, personal responsibility isn't important. I mean, you should stand up straight and clean your room and do all that stuff, right? But the problem, other than that, it's just kind of anodyne and preachy. You know, I mean, the problem is with as exactly the rule that Žižek identified, that, you know, putting your house in perfect order, you know, before you try to change the world, you know, because as Matt was indicating earlier, your house is never going to be in perfect order. Nobody's house is ever going to be in perfect order, and the world needs to be changed.
Yeah, and frankly, I think I'd be pretty fucking scared if I got to the point where I figured, oh, everything in my life is just going so swimmingly. Because I think, you know, in true Scorsesean fashion, like, I'm going to
be involved in politics after everything had already achieved this magical state of perfection in your personal life.
Well, I was also saying, it's true Scorsesean fashion. I figure, oh fuck, you know, I've reached the plateau, and there's only fucking downhill from here, right? It's all going south.
Yeah, you're entering into that last half hour of the Scorsese gangster movie, you know, where everything falls apart.
Yeah, exactly. Right?
I can see I can hear the helicopters soon.
Exactly. All right, guys. This has been great as always. We are, in a week or two, we are going to do part 4, a little coda to the trilogy. That's going to be much shorter than any of the 3 elements of the trilogy per se. You know, since we've got 22 minutes left in the debate, and then we'll talk about that and detox a little bit. So more Žižek Peterson to look forward to. Happy as always to chat with these guys. Either of you have anything you want to plug before we go? All right.
I have a piece coming out for the Bias magazine soon on post-liberalism, which is really a kind of right-wing Catholicism that's very popular in American conservative circles right now. So people might want to keep an eye out for that if they're interested in some of my own thoughts about, you know, the right way to interpret Christianity. Žižek.
The Patrick Deneen, Sohrab Ahmari, all of those, like
all those fun guys.
All those fun guys. Yeah, I always think of the Monty Python, you know, the line of monks, you know, with the boards.
Yeah. Just smacking them.
Yeah. They I don't like that. That view creeps me out so badly. It's like that. Just the sort of. It's like, yeah, no, that's the problem, right? I mean, we've figured out what the problem is with like early 21st century liberal capitalism. It's that it's gone too far forward. Like
Yeah, I know.
we just need to go back to when the church could just tell you what to do, and no. Peasants knew that God wanted them to, to serve the Lord on their landed estate, and heretics could be burnt. Like that's when we really got things right. It's like all of this, like religious neutrality, equality before the law. Liberal pluralism. That's where it goes wrong. It's certainly not the economic system. It's the social tolerance.
Oh yeah, and if you think that that's an exaggeration, funny thing is, you can read Adrian Vermeule's article in The Atlantic criticizing originalism, which might seem a little bit odd, since originalism, a constitutional interpretation, is the be-all and end-all, or was at least for conservative constitutionalists for a while. But one of the things Vermeule says in this article is exactly what you said, Ben. We should just shuck the pretense of trying to be neutral in our application of the law and enforce a hard, socially conservative viewpoint on the American population, and have no bones about it, right? And if a literal interpretation of the American Constitution gets in the way, well, then we'll just do what he thinks liberals have done for a long time, which is reinterpret or ignore the parts of the Constitution that we don't like. And it's pretty scary stuff, since it sounds basically like he's saying we should go medieval on their ass, and it's pretty frightening.
I actually literally just watching Pulp Fiction last night. That's good.
Yeah.
All right, guys. This was great. Thank you, Adore Pryor, for the super chat. So we will finish this up in a week or two. See you guys back there then. Left is